Zethka stared at the assignment orders displayed on the holographic screen in front of him and felt his 3 hearts sink with dread. Not because the mission was dangerous, but because it seemed so incredibly boring compared to his previous work, documenting the fierce Zartan warrior culture or the brilliant tactical innovations of the hegemony during their expansion wars. This new assignment involved observing a species called humans who had only recently joined the galactic community and were about to face their first real interstellar conflict against something called the Korthek Empire, and Zethka had read the preliminary reports, which described humans as unremarkable bipeds with basic technology and conventional military thinking, nothing that would add meaningful data to the Galactic Research Consortium's vast database of warfare studies. The orders came directly from High Command, which meant Zethka could not refuse even though his expertise lay in documenting advanced combat techniques and revolutionary battle strategies, not watching primitive newcomers stumble through their first real war. His supervisor had explained that every species needed to be documented for historical completeness and that humans represented an interesting case study in how recently civilized worlds adapted to galactic-scale conflicts. Though Zethka suspected he was being punished for his harsh criticism of the consortium's recent publication on Kelvaron siege tactics, which he had called embarrassingly superficial. The transport ship carrying Zethka to the human vessel arrived 3 days later, and he spent the journey reviewing what little information existed about human military capabilities. Their weapons appeared to be projectile-based with some basic energy components. Their ships used standard fusion drives with conventional shielding. Their tactics seemed to follow predictable patterns based on territorial defense and resource acquisition. Everything about them screamed mediocrity, and Zethka began composing his report in his head about how some species simply lacked the innovative spark necessary for interesting warfare. Captain Jake Morrison greeted Zethka personally when he boarded the human ship called Uns Defiant, which surprised the observer since most military commanders delegated such tasks to subordinates. Morrison appeared pleasant enough with the standard human features of bilateral symmetry, forward-facing eyes, and that peculiar covering of hair on the top of his head. He spoke in the common galactic language with only a slight accent and seemed genuinely interested in making Zethka comfortable during his stay aboard the vessel. Morrison explained human military structure as they walked through the ship's corridors, and Zethka noted that the humans kept their vessel remarkably clean and organized, though he detected an odd tension in the crew that he could not quite identify. It was not fear exactly, but something more subtle, like the feeling of a predator waiting patiently for the right moment to strike. Though Zethka dismissed this impression as probably just his imagination, since humans were clearly not apex predators based on their physical specifications. Lieutenant Amy Foster was assigned to show Zethka to his observation quarters, and she proved to be even more talkative than her captain, chattering about human customs and military traditions as she led him through the ship. She mentioned casually that this would be really interesting for someone who had never seen humans fight. Before and when Zethka asked what she meant by that, Foster just smiled in a way that made him slightly uncomfortable and said he would understand soon. Enough. The quarters provided for Zethka were spacious and well-equipped with everything he needed for his documentation work, including access to the ship's sensor networks and communication systems. Foster explained that he would have complete freedom to observe and record everything except for certain classified strategic discussions, though she assured him that he would see plenty of actual combat to make his report comprehensive and valuable. To the consortium, Zethka spent his first evening aboard the Defiant, reviewing human military records that had been provided by the consortium, and found exactly what he expected to find. Standard projectile weapons that fired metal slugs at high velocity, basic energy shields that could deflect most common attacks, CONVNTIO, ship designs that prioritized function over innovation, tactical doctrines that emphasized coordinated unit actions and overwhelming firepower. Nothing in the record suggested humans possessed anything beyond typical newcomer capabilities, and certainly nothing that would revolutionize galactic military thinking. The observer prepared his standard documentation protocols, and set up his recording equipment to capture whatever battles lay ahead. Expecting to spend a few months gathering routine combat footage and tactical analysis before returning to the consortium with yet another unremarkable study of mediocre military capabilities, he had no idea that everything he thought he knew about warfare was about to be shattered by creatures who had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of killing each other with an efficiency and creativity that would make the galaxy's most feared warriors flee in absolute terror. 3 days after Zethka arrived aboard the Defiant, the ship joined a small human fleet at the edge of what the humans called contested space, and the observer was surprised by how few vessels the humans had brought to face the Korthic Empire. Only 12 ships compared to the hundreds that most species would consider necessary for major military operations. But Captain Morrison seemed completely confident as he explained that human doctrine favored quality over quantity and that each ship in their fleet was worth 10 of most other species' vessels. A claim that Zethka found difficult to believe given the unremarkable specifications he had reviewed. Admiral Kate Sullivan appeared on the main bridge screen via hologram to brief the combined fleet, and Zethka was struck by how calm and professional she appeared despite facing a species that had conquered dozens of worlds across the galaxy. Sullivan explained that the Korthek had taken 3 human colonies and standard rescue and reclamation mission parameters would apply, though she mentioned something called Protocol 7 that would be implemented if the situation escalated beyond normal engagement levels. When Zethka asked Morrison what Protocol 7 meant, the captain just smiled and said the observer would probably not need to worry about it. The first engagement began when Korthik raiders attacked a human supply convoy near the edge of the system, and Zethka positioned himself on the bridge to observe as Lieutenant Commander Ryan Clark coordinated the defense. The Korthik ships were impressive with their dark hulls and aggressive weapon configurations, exactly the sort of vessels that had terrorized peaceful worlds for generations. But as Zethka watched the battle unfold on the tactical displays, he began to see something that defied every expectation he had formed about human military capabilities. The human ships moved with a precision that seemed almost choreographed, each vessel knowing exactly where the others would be at any given moment without apparent communication. Their weapon fire was devastatingly accurate and seemed to target not just the enemy ships, but specific systems in a way that suggested intimate knowledge of Korthik technology. Most disturbing of all was the way human tactics seemed to anticipate Korthik movements, as if the humans had fought this exact battle many times before. Clark's voice remained steady and calm as he issued orders that made no sense to Zethka until he saw their results, directing human ships to positions that seemed tactically unsound, until the Korthik moved exactly where Clark had predicted they would move, allowing the humans to deliver devastating attacks from unexpected angles. Within 30 minutes, the raiding force was either destroyed or fleeing, and the humans had not lost a single vessel. Sergeant Lisa Hayes led a boarding party onto a damaged Korthik vessel that had been disabled but not destroyed, and Zethka watched through security feeds as the humans moved through the alien corridors with fluid efficiency that made his skin crawl. They did not advance like soldiers exploring unknown territory, but like predators who knew exactly where their prey was hiding. Their weapons were held ready, but not frantically, their movements coordinated without obvious communication, and their faces showed an expression that Zethka had never seen on any sentient being before. When the boarding party encountered resistance from cornered Korthik warriors, something happened that disturbed even Zethka's scientific detachment. The Korthik were supposed to be among the most fierce fighters in the galaxy, creatures who had built an empire through sheer aggression and refusal to surrender. But as they faced the advancing humans, several of them triggered suicide charges rather than continue fighting, something that their own species considered the ultimate dishonor. Hayes reported the successful capture of the vessel and the recovery of valuable intelligence about Korthik fleet movements. But what struck Zethka most was not the tactical success, but the unusual fear response he had witnessed from the Korthik warriors. In all his years of documenting galactic warfare, he had never seen members of an aggressive warrior culture choose death over combat. And when he asked Morrison about this, the captain's expression became thoughtful, and he said quietly that sometimes even the bravest fighters recognized when they were outmatched. The aftermath of the battle was equally disturbing to Zethka as he watched the human crew process what had just happened. There was no celebration or relief that might be expected after a successful defense. Instead, the humans went about their duties with calm efficiency, as if destroying a superior enemy force was simply another routine task. Morrison updated Admiral Sullivan on their status and mentioned that the Korthag had tested their defenses, with predictable results, though Sullivan's response suggested that this small engagement was merely the beginning of something much larger. Morrison invited Zethka to observe the interrogation of captured Korthag prisoners, and what the observer witnessed challenged his understanding of both species. The Korthag warriors were clearly terrified of their human captors despite being treated according to all galactic conventions regarding prisoners of war. They answered questions readily and seemed eager to provide any information that might hasten their removal from human custody. One of them actually begged to be transferred to any other species' prison facilities rather than remain aboard a human vessel that evening. Zethka reviewed his recordings and tried to make sense of what he had observed. The humans had demonstrated combat capabilities that far exceeded anything suggested by their official specifications. Their tactical coordination implied years of experience fighting together despite their recent entry into galactic civilization. And most puzzling of all was the fear they seemed to inspire in the Korthak, a species that had never shown fear of any enemy in recorded history. As he prepared his daily report for the consortium, Zethka found himself struggling to describe what he had witnessed in terms that would be believed by his superiors. The idea that humans might possess military capabilities beyond their apparent technological level seemed impossible. Yet the evidence was undeniable, and as he settled into his quarters for the night, Zethka began to suspect that his boring assignment might become something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. The conflict escalated dramatically when Korthak reinforcements arrived in overwhelming numbers just 2 days after the initial skirmish, and Zethka counted nearly 50 enemy vessels on the tactical display compared to the humans' 12 ships. Odds that would have caused any reasonable military commander to call for immediate retreat. But Captain Morrison merely nodded when the sensor readings came in and announced to his bridge crew that it was time to implement Protocol 7, a phrase that caused subtle but noticeable changes in the behavior of every human aboard the Defiant Zethka. Requested clarification about Protocol 7 but received only cryptic responses about necessary measures and acceptable losses from Morrison. Though the observer noticed that the captain's pleasant demeanor had shifted into something more focused and somehow predatory, the same transformation seemed to be occurring throughout the ship as crew members moved with increased efficiency and displayed expressions that reminded Zethka uncomfortably of hunting predators preparing for a kill. Admiral Sullivan's voice came over the communication system with orders that confused Zethka because they seemed to involve splitting the human fleet into smaller groups that would be even more outnumbered. But the human officers received these instructions with calm acknowledgement as if they made perfect tactical sense. Morrison explained that humans had learned long ago that superior numbers meant nothing if the enemy could not coordinate their attacks effectively, though he did not elaborate on what methods the humans would use to disrupt. Korthak Coordination Major Ben Carter led the ground forces in the liberation of New Austin Colony, and Zethka accompanied the landing party as an official observer, expecting to document standard urban warfare tactics as human soldiers cleared buildings and rescued civilians. But what he witnessed in the colony streets challenged every assumption he had formed about human military doctrine and left him questioning whether he truly understood the nature of warfare. At all, the humans did not advance through the colony like soldiers conducting a rescue operation, but moved like apex predators systematically hunting their prey. Each squad seemed to know exactly where Korthak defenders would position themselves and approach those positions, with tactical innovations that Zethka had never seen documented in any military manual. They used psychological warfare techniques that left surviving Korthek warriors traumatized and unwilling to continue fighting even when they had superior defensive positions. Carter's forces demonstrated an understanding of urban combat that suggested expensive experience fighting in similar environments. Though Zethka knew that humans had only recently begun interstellar colonization and should not have had opportunities to develop such specialized tactics, their coordination was flawless as different squads moved through the colony in patterns that confused the Korthek defenders and allowed the humans to attack from directions that should have been impossible. What disturbed Zethka most was not the tactical efficiency of the human assault, but the calculated brutality with which they conducted their operations. They did not simply defeat enemy positions, but eliminated them in ways that maximized psychological impact on other defenders. Using methods that were technically within galactic warfare conventions, but pushed the boundaries of what most species would consider acceptable behavior in combat situations. Communications specialist Dana Webb intercepted Korthek transmissions during the battle and provided real-time translation that revealed something deeply troubling about how the enemy perceived their human opponents. The Korthek warriors were calling for immediate evacuation using terms that roughly translated to "the relentless ones" and "death that thinks," descriptions that no military force in galactic history had ever applied to human soldiers. The Korthek commander's final transmission before his forces abandoned the colony contained references to humans that made Zethka's blood run cold, describing them as creatures who hunt with the patience of mountains and the fury of stars, beings who turn battle into art and suffering into science, and most disturbing of all, a species that wages war not for victory but for the joy of perfect destruction. Words that seemed impossible to apply to the pleasant human Zethka had been living among when the colony was secured. Carter briefed his soldiers on the next phase of operations with casual efficiency that made the complete destruction of Korthek resistance seem like routine administrative work. He mentioned that the enemy's psychological state was now optimal for Phase 2 implementation, though when Zethka asked what Phase 2 involved, Carter simply smiled and said the observer would see soon enough the aftermath of the liberation, revealed something that made Zethka begin to seriously question his own safety among the humans. The rescued colonists showed genuine gratitude toward their liberators but also displayed subtle signs of fear that suggested they understood something about human military capabilities that outsiders were not meant to know. Their relief at being rescued was mixed with an emotion that looked suspiciously like the same terror he had seen in Korthek prisoners. Morrison invited Zethka to observe the interrogation of captured Korthek officers, and what the observer witnessed convinced him that humans possessed capabilities that went far beyond conventional military training. The prisoners were questioned using techniques that were technically non-violent, but produced psychological effects that left hardened warriors begging to provide information. Methods that suggested humans had extensive experience in breaking the will of captured enemies. That evening, Zethka attempted to access classified human historical databases using his observer credentials and was surprised to find that most military records were restricted far beyond normal security protocols. The few files he could access contained references to conflicts and campaigns that seemed to span far longer periods than human space travel should have allowed, suggesting either errors in the database or the possibility that human military experience was far more extensive than officially reported. As he prepared his daily report for the consortium, Zethka found himself struggling with the growing realization that he might be documenting something far more significant and dangerous than a simple interstellar conflict. The humans were not just effective soldiers but seemed to possess an understanding of warfare that bordered on the supernatural, and the fear they inspired in their enemies suggested capabilities that no species should possess. After only a few decades of interstellar travel, the final entry in his log that night contained a disturbing observation that would haunt his dreams for months to come. During the colony liberation, he had noticed human soldiers displaying expressions of what could only be described as enjoyment during combat. Not the satisfaction of duty fulfilled or victory achieved, but the genuine pleasure of predators engaged in their natural behavior, an observation that made him wonder if humans might be fundamentally different from every other species he had studied in ways that could reshape galactic civilization. Colonel Chris Parker arrived aboard the Defiant with detailed plans for something called Operation Cleansing Fire, and Zethka was permitted to observe the senior staff briefing where human strategic planning unfolded with a complexity that made his head spin. The operation was not simply an assault on the Cortex primary staging area, but an intricate campaign designed to achieve what Parker described as complete psychological neutralization of enemy resistance through systematic application of terror tactics. Words that made Zethka realize the humans were not planning military victory, but the total destruction of Cortex ability to fight. The briefing revealed levels of tactical sophistication that should not have been possible for a species so new to galactic warfare. Parker's presentation included detailed analysis of Cortex psychology, cultural weaknesses, command structure vulnerabilities, and social pressures that could be exploited to cause maximum disruption, information that must have taken decades to gather and analyze, but which the humans somehow possessed, despite their recent first contact with this enemy. Parker explained that humans had developed what he called asymmetric psychological warfare, which involved using enemy expectations against them in ways that caused cascade failures throughout their command structure. The goal was not to defeat Cortex forces in traditional battle, but to make them so terrified of fighting humans that they would surrender without resistance, a strategy that required intimate understanding of alien psychology that no newcomer species should possess. Captain Nicole Turner's Special Forces unit was assigned the most critical mission, and Zethka was granted permission to observe their operations through remote sensors. What he witnessed during the assault on the Cortex staging facility convinced him that humans possessed capabilities that bordered on the supernatural and certainly exceeded anything that should have been possible based on their official technological specifications. Turner's soldiers moved through the alien facility like ghosts, appearing and disappearing in ways that suggested either advanced cloaking technology or tactical skills that had been developed through extensive combat experience. They demonstrated instant adaptation to alien technology and weapon systems, turning captured Cortex equipment against its creators with efficiency that implied previous familiarity with these systems. Most disturbing was the tactical flexibility displayed by Turner's unit as they encountered unexpected resistance. They seemed to anticipate every defensive measure the Cortex employed and had countermeasures ready before the enemy could implement their strategies, fighting with coordination that appeared almost telepathic and using improvised weapons and tactics that suggested years of experience in similar operations. Zethka began accessing deeper layers of human historical databases using enhanced observer privileges, and what he discovered explained everything while simultaneously horrifying him beyond measure. Human military history did not begin with their entry into galactic civilization, but stretched back thousands of years through an unbroken chain of constant warfare against their own species on their home planet. The database revealed that humans had spent millennia engaged in what they called total war against each other, conflicts that involved not just military forces but entire populations and economic systems, campaigns that continued for generations and involved levels of destruction that most galactic species had never imagined possible, wars that had refined human understanding of violence to a degree that made them the ultimate predators in any conflict situation. Every conceivable form of combat had been explored and perfected by humans fighting other humans throughout their history, from individual assassination techniques to planetary siege warfare, from psychological operations designed to break enemy morale to economic campaigns intended to destroy entire civilizations. They had practiced every possible variation of violence on each other for thousands of years before joining the galactic community. The historical records showed that human military doctrine was based not on theoretical analysis but on practical experience gained through countless conflicts where failure meant extinction. They had learned to fight not through academic study but through survival, developing tactics and strategies through trial and error across generations of warfare that had eliminated every weakness and refined every strength. Sithka discovered that human concepts of acceptable losses, collateral damage, and necessary brutality were calibrated by conflicts where entire species survival had been at stake, making their current operations against the Korthik seem almost restrained by comparison to what they had done to each other during their worst historical periods. Conflicts that had forged them into creatures capable of viewing genocide as a tactical option rather than an unthinkable atrocity. The database contained records of human conflicts that had involved weapons and strategies that were banned by galactic convention, wars where biological and chemical weapons had been used routinely, campaigns where civilian populations had been deliberately targeted to break enemy morale, sieges that had continued for decades until entire civilizations had been reduced to scattered survivors. Turner's mission report arrived as Zethka was reviewing these historical records and the clinical efficiency with which she described the complete neutralization of Korthik resistance made perfect sense in the context of human military heritage. She had not just defeated enemy forces but had eliminated their ability to coordinate future resistance through methods that would have been considered war crimes if employed by any other species. The psychological impact assessments included in Turner's report showed that surviving Korthik forces were now calling humans demons and destroyers of worlds, terms that suggested the aliens had recognized something fundamental about human nature that Zethka was only beginning to understand. They were not fighting another military force but confronting the evolutionary product of thousands of years of refined violence. As he compiled his observations for that day's report to the consortium, Zethka realized that he was not documenting the military capabilities of a newcomer species but recording the first galactic deployment of creatures who had turned warfare into both science and art through millennia of practice on each other. Beings who approached conflict with the casual expertise of professionals engaging in their life's work. The final entry in his log that night contained an observation that made him question the wisdom of his entire mission. During Turner's briefing, he had noticed that she spoke about the complete destruction of enemy resistance with the same tone most species used to discuss routine maintenance tasks, displaying an attitude toward violence that suggested humans viewed warfare not as a necessary evil, but as a natural and even enjoyable activity that allowed them to exercise skills they had been developing for thousands of years. General Alex Martinez arrived with the main human battle fleet 3 days later, and Zethka felt his heart nearly stop when he saw the size of the force. Over 200 ships had been assembled for what Martinez described as the final solution to the Korthik problem, though the observer was beginning to understand that this was not a rescue or defense operation but something far more sinister that the humans called threat elimination through permanent incapacitation. Words that could only mean one thing despite their clinical phrasing. Martinez briefed the combined fleet commanders on what he called the Korthik Pacification Protocol, and Zethka realized with growing horror that the humans had decided the Korthik Empire represented an existential threat to galactic peace and needed to be eliminated completely, not defeated or contained but utterly destroyed as a functioning civilization, a goal that required capabilities and mindset that no other species in galactic history had ever possessed or wanted to possess. A planning session revealed that humans approached warfare with a philosophical framework that was fundamentally different from every other intelligent species. While most civilizations fought wars to achieve specific political or economic goals, humans fought wars to ensure their enemies could never threaten them again, employing strategies designed to eliminate not just military resistance but the cultural and psychological foundation that made resistance possible. Commander Tony Ross was assigned to explain human military philosophy to the increasingly horrified Zethka, and what the observer learned during their conversation changed his understanding of the species in ways that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Ross described warfare as humanity's greatest cultural achievement, and spoke about combat with the enthusiasm most species reserve for discussing art or music or scientific discovery. Ross explained that humans had developed the concept of total war through necessity during their planetary conflicts, fighting not just for territory or resources, but for species survival against enemies who would accept nothing less than complete destruction. These experiences had taught them that half measures in warfare were ultimately more cruel than decisive action because they prolonged suffering without resolving the underlying conflict of philosophical framework. Ross treated warfare as a natural extension of evolutionary competition where the ultimate goal was not victory but ensuring that defeated enemies could never again pose a threat. This meant that human military doctrine included options for systematic elimination of enemy populations, destruction of their technological base, and psychological conditioning designed to eliminate their will to resist Martinez's operational briefing revealed that the assault on Korthik Prime would implement tactics that had been developed during humanity's worst historical conflicts, strategies that involved simultaneous attacks on military targets, civilian infrastructure, communication networks, and cultural symbols designed to break enemy morale so completely that resistance would become psychologically impossible. Zethka observed the preliminary bombardment through the ship's sensor network and watched in horror as human forces demonstrated coordination that seemed to transcend normal military efficiency. Every ship in the fleet knew exactly what every other ship was doing without apparent communication, their movements flowing like a single organism, with 200 bodies working toward the complete destruction of everything that made Korthak civilization possible. The ground assault that followed was conducted with precision that made previous human operations seem restrained by comparison. Admiral Helen Barnes coordinated orbital bombardment with ground forces in a display of combined arms warfare that reduced a planetary defense network to rubble within hours, using tactics that eliminated military resistance while leaving infrastructure intact for occupation and control. Barnes explained to Zethka that humans had learned to view planetary assault as a form of applied psychology rather than simple military operation. The goal was not just to defeat defending forces, but to demonstrate human capabilities so completely that other civilizations would understand the futility of resistance, creating deterrent effects that would prevent future conflicts. The systematic destruction of Korthik resistance proceeded with efficiency that made Zethka understand why the enemy warriors had chosen suicide rather than face capture. Human forces moved through defending positions like natural disasters, unstoppable and implacable, eliminating everything in their path, with methods that were technically within galactic warfare conventions but pushed the boundaries of acceptable. Conductores briefed Zethka on human concepts of proportional response and explained that humans had learned through bitter experience that conflicts ended quickly only when one side demonstrated such overwhelming superiority that continued resistance became obviously pointless. This philosophy justified tactics that other species would consider excessive, but which humans viewed as ultimately more merciful than prolonged warfare. The observer watched through remote sensors as human soldiers secured key installations on Korthik Prime and noted that they moved through alien facilities with familiarity that suggested extensive prior knowledge of Korthak technology and tactics. Adaptation that should have taken months or years, but which the humans displayed immediately upon first contact with new equipment. Communication intercepts revealed that surviving Korthik forces were broadcasting surrender offers before human troops even reached their positions, describing themselves as defeated by demons and begging for mercy from creatures they now understood were capable of eliminating their entire species with casual efficiency. Requests that human commanders acknowledged with professional courtesy while maintaining operational momentum. The speed with which Korthik resistance collapsed convinced Zethka that human military capabilities were based on something far more fundamental than technological superiority or tactical innovation. They possessed an understanding of violence that had been refined through thousands of years of practice against enemies who shared their own capacity for destruction, experience that made current operations seem almost routine. Martinez's final briefing revealed that the Korthik Empire had ceased to exist as a functioning political entity within 72 hours of the beginning of human operations. A timeline that seemed impossible until Zethka realized that humans had not been fighting a war but conducting an exercise in applied psychology designed to break enemy will rather than simply defeat enemy forces as. He reviewed the day's events for his report to the consortium. Zethka found himself struggling with the realization that he had witnessed not military operations but the systematic implementation of techniques that humans had developed through millennia of warfare against each other. Methods that had been refined through conflicts where failure meant extinction and which now made them capable of eliminating any threat with terrifying efficiency that other species could not hope to match or understand. The Korthic Empire ceased to exist exactly 96 hours after General Martinez had declared the beginning of final operations, and Zethka watched in stunned silence as the most feared warrior civilization in the galaxy surrendered unconditionally and begged for mercy from creatures they now described as the ending of all things, terms that revealed how completely human psychological warfare had broken their will to resist and made continued fighting seem not just futile but cosmically impossible, Captain. Morrison explained to Zethka that humans would accept the surrender and treat all prisoners according to galactic conventions regarding warfare. But the observer noticed how carefully the human forces monitored their former enemies and established monitoring systems that would ensure no future resistance could develop, creating what Morrison described as permanent pacification through psychological conditioning and cultural restructuring, words that meant the Korthic would never again pose a threat to anyone. The processing of Korthic surrender revealed organizational capabilities that demonstrated human understanding of post-conflict operations that went far beyond military victory. They had prepared detailed plans for managing entire populations, restructuring alien societies, and implementing cultural changes that would eliminate the psychological foundations that made warfare possible. Preparations that must have taken years to develop but which they implemented with smooth efficiency. Morrison's briefing on post-conflict administration revealed that humans approached occupation not as temporary military control but as permanent cultural engineering designed to eliminate the possibility of future resistance. They had developed techniques for managing conquered populations that ensured compliance without requiring constant military presence. Methods that were technically humane but fundamentally changed the nature of conquered civilizations. Zethka was permitted to observe the initial processing of Korthic prisoners, and what he witnessed convinced him that human capabilities extended far beyond warfare into areas of social control and psychological manipulation that no other species had ever developed. The former warriors were not simply defeated but had been transformed into something resembling grateful servants, who seemed genuinely relieved to be under human protection. The systematic nature of human post-conflict operations suggested that they had extensive experience in managing conquered populations and rebuilding alien societies according to human specifications, capabilities that should not have existed in a species so new to galactic civilization, but which they deployed with expertise that implied thousands of years of practice in similar situations. Admiral Barnes explained to Zethka that human military doctrine included extensive provisions for what they called cultural rehabilitation of defeated enemies, techniques designed to eliminate aggressive tendencies and replace them with cooperative behaviors that would prevent future conflicts, methods that were presented as humanitarian efforts but which fundamentally altered the nature of conquered species. The observer began compiling his final report for the Galactic Research Consortium, but found himself struggling with how to present findings that would challenge every assumption about human nature and capabilities. The evidence was overwhelming that humans represented something unprecedented in galactic civilization, but describing that evidence in terms that would be believed by his superiors seemed almost impossible. The historical database analysis had revealed that humans were not peaceful explorers who had learned to fight when necessary, but were evolved predators who had spent millennia refining their capacity for violence against each other. Creatures who had turned warfare into both science and art through countless conflicts that had eliminated every weakness and perfected every technique for destroying enemies. Zethka's final interviews with human personnel revealed attitudes toward violence, and conquest that disturbed him more than any battlefield atrocity he had witnessed. They spoke about the complete destruction of enemy resistance with casual satisfaction and discussed future conflicts with anticipation that suggested they viewed warfare not as necessary evil but as natural and enjoyable expression of their fundamental nature. The realization that humans had not become monsters during their war against the Korthik but had always been monsters who had finally found an acceptable target for their monstrous capabilities made Zethka understand that his mission had documented something far more significant than military operations. He had recorded the first galactic deployment of creatures who represented the ultimate evolutionary product of constant warfare. Morrison's final briefing contained recommendations for future human military operations that revealed plans for expanding their sphere of influence throughout the galaxy, not through conquest but through what he called preventive pacification of species that might someday pose threats, strategies that would eliminate potential enemies before they could develop capabilities that might challenge human dominance. The processing of his observational data revealed patterns that made Zethka realize that every human action during the conflict had been calculated to achieve maximum psychological impact on observers as well as enemies. They had been aware throughout the campaign that their performance was being documented, and had deliberately displayed capabilities designed to establish their reputation as invincible opponents. As he prepared his final report, Zethka found himself faced with the terrifying responsibility of warning the Galactic Consortium about the true nature of the species they had welcomed into their civilization. Humans were not dangerous because they were aggressive or technologically advanced, but because they were evolved predators who had perfected the art of eliminating threats through thousands of years of practice on each other. The final entry in his observational log contained a recommendation that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. He advised the consortium that under no circumstances should any member species give humans reason to view them as existential threats, because humans were capable of friendship and cooperation with allies but were also capable of systematic genocide, conducted with cheerful efficiency against anyone they perceived as enemies of Kaz. Concluding analysis revealed the fundamental horror of what he had witnessed. Humans had not joined galactic civilization as explorers seeking knowledge or traders seeking profit, but as barely contained weapons of war who approached diplomacy as an extension of military strategy, creatures who could be trusted as long as their interests aligned with others but who would eliminate any species that threatened their vision of galactic order. The final line of his report contained an observation that captured the essential truth about humanity that would reshape galactic politics for generations to come. Humans were not monsters who had been created by war, but were monsters who had been refined by war, creatures who had spent thousands of years becoming the perfect killers, and who now walked among the stars with smiles on their faces and death in their hearts, waiting patiently for the next species foolish enough to threaten them.